And as we move on to the next slide, the WHMP itself sits within a greater framework of airport documents. So these documents include the safety management system, so the top-down or organisational approach to managing safety risk, the aerodrome manual. Some aerodromes and operators provide a summary of the WHMP in the aerodrome manual with the detail provided in a separate document, while as others provide detail in the manual itself. Now, this is generally commensurate with the scale and complexity of the operations and the wildlife risk at the site. Standard operating procedures, which Kylie will touch on a little bit later, are also heavily related, and the standard operating procedures with regards to wildlife management generally sit within this plan. Aerodrome emergency plan is another one, the airport master plan, and as well as other environmental plans and strategies. So yeah, there is an important cohesion required between all of these plans within the aerodrome. So there are three main triggers for development and implementation of a new wildlife hazard management plan, and they're legislated within the manual standards. So if we click on the first trigger is based on the number of people. So if an airport has 50,000 or more passenger movements, development of a wildlife hazard management plan and implementation of that plan is required. The second trigger is based on number of aircraft movements. So where there are 100,000 or more aircraft movements, a wildlife hazard management plan is required. But it's also critically important to note that as the regulatory body, CASA may also direct an aerodrome to develop and implement a WHMP if it's considered necessary in the interest of aviation safety. So there are several factors that trigger a review of a WHMP. Significant strike event would be a key trigger. For example, if an aircraft has multiple wildlife strikes, substantial damage following any wildlife strike, or an engine ingestion. If there's an ongoing presence of wildlife at the aerodrome that may cause an above mentioned event, for example, this could be a rapid increase or unusual influx of flocking or migratory birds. It could also be a new or unusual continued presence of a large bodied bird like your peacocks, pelicans, cranes and the like. And not only could it be a rapid influx, but this also could be a slow increase in birds over time, utilising habitat, becoming habituated. And this, at this stage, this is really important where monitoring occurs over a long span of time. So you can provide evidence in decision making, and that will trigger a review. So on this slide, we have an image here that's been adopted from the Australian Airports practice note, number 9, which is on wildlife hazard management at airports. Now, this resource is available online, and I'm sure we can send the link out to anyone who's interested in reviewing this practice note. It is a fairly valuable resource. So the image depicts a suggested approach for the development of a wildlife hazard management plan. As with any risk assessment, there needs to be provisions for review and update. A risk assessment itself should generally be fluid and dynamic, and they're not a static document, and they need to be able to adapt to change in risk profiles over time. So review and update is critical to this whole process in safety, and it's It's critical that the correct risk profile is captured and the appropriate mitigations are put in place. So as you step down, we've obviously got, assessing the hazard, working onto the risk assessment, identifying and setting targets, compiling all your operational procedures, ensuring compliance, and then finalising for distribution. So working through the full process just to make sure that this document is comprehensive and it covers all the factors that are required for effective wildlife management. So CASA-MOZ Manual Standards 139 requires a review of the WHMP as part of a technical inspection. And this needs to be supported where necessary with the assistance of a suitably qualified and experienced aviation ecologist. Each annual review should be based on performance indicators, assessments and findings, detailed progress plans against the KPIs or key performance indicators, recommended management actions to reduce further strike, and they need to ensure they compile all the current legislation and reassess the risk to determine the current and high and moderate risk species. Now, wildlife behaviour and habituation will change over time for several reasons. For example, drainage improvements might occur on an airport between review periods. So what that might do is lead to a reduction in water birds at the site. And as you monitor this over time or over a longer term, it may be observed that certain species no longer are habituated to the site or occur on the site. So this will obviously affect the risk rating and the risk profile on the site. So changing the plan itself. So also need to ensure that all plans, procedures, roles and responsibilities are current and relevant. We all know that staff move on from time to time and structural changes occur within organisations. So it's fairly critical that during these reviews we understand the roles and responsibilities and who is nominated for those responsibilities, and we just need to ensure that they're contemporary and up to date with the organisation and the aerodrome itself. So a wildlife hazard management plan must be prepared in consultation with a suitably qualified or experienced person. So outlined is an ornithologist, biologist, and with demonstrated expertise in wildlife management and management of wildlife hazards. So demonstrated experience is the key input with this one. So as you can probably appreciate, not all ornithologists or biologists understand or have the experience with the complexities and also the operational and day-to-day happenings of an aerodrome. So having that context and conversely, not all airport managers and aerodrome operators are going to understand wildlife behaviour and ecological interactions. So it's really having the experience of the two that really makes that person or that suitably qualified person key to the whole development of the wildlife hazard management plan. And just to follow on from earlier, it is the aerodrome operator's responsibility to implement the wildlife hazard management plan and to keep the plan under continuous review. And the key with these two are monitoring and reporting. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to hand over to Kylie and she's going to discuss preparing a wildlife hazard management plan in a little more depth for you.
Thank you, Andrew. Good morning, everybody. As Andrew said, I'll be talking you through some of the requirements that airports need to include in their wildlife hazard management plan once they have been triggered. Andrew talked about the responsibilities and the review and the triggers. So now we'll talk a little about what airports actually have to have in their wildlife hazard management plans. as a minimum in accordance with the legislation. So there are 6 main inclusions for the WHMP, and I won't go through each one now. I want to actually look in more detail for each of those 6 inclusions. We could have the next slide, please. Okay, so the first element that WHMPs should have is the responsibilities of the relevant airport staff. So that's staff who are involved in some capacity for either monitoring or managing wildlife hazards. I have some examples here of what some of those responsibilities might look like for some key airport staff, keeping in mind that obviously it depends on the size of the operations, how many different departments and personnel are involved in implementing the WHMP, but this is just an example of some of those basic responsibilities. Looking at the airport manager, for example, they may be responsible for overseeing the implementation of the WHMP. They may be responsible for ensuring that the safety team is trained and competent in their wildlife hazard management duties. And they might also be responsible for liaising with the various airport stakeholders and any adjacent land users that may be contributing to the wildlife risk. Another example there might be the safety manager or the safety team leader or the head of the safety department to ensure that all the safety team are competent in their roles, that their team are implementing the WHMP in accordance with the requirements of that plan, and they might also be responsible for coordinating wildlife hazard management committees and so forth. So there are a lot of responsibilities associated with wildlife hazard management, whether it be administrative or operational. But as I mentioned, it really does depend on who's responsible for what at your particular airport. But I should also add that the responsibilities don't necessarily need to lie just with the airport. You may have an operation that allows input from airlines or the regulator or environment departments or whoever else has a vested interest in wildlife hazard management. Next slide, please. The second inclusion in WHMPs for Australian airports is to identify the wildlife attractions, both on the airport and in the airport's vicinity. So, for example, we have an airport here that has, through monitoring, through surveys, through inspections and assessments of their airfield, they have identified particular attractants on their airfield. For example, if we look at this image from the bottom left, and we'll move around in a clockwise direction, they identified that in one of their hangars there was a significant pigeon roost. Above that, there was an area on the airfield that was particularly attractive to, thank you for that pointer, particularly attractive to a bird, an ibis that was foraging in grass. So they could then identify the particular attractant, the particular species of grass that was attracting those ibis. Above that, there is a low-lying area on the airfield that after rainfall accumulates with water, which makes the opportunity for birds to forage much more appealing, and at those times would see a big increase in wildlife activity. Moving over to the right, there was an area on the airfield that plovers, which is a ground nesting bird here, where they had established a breeding territory and were successfully having breeding seasons. They also identified on this particular airfield fox dens, which they identified through their monitoring, particularly their monitoring of an evening. And this particular airfield also has an open drain with permanent water that continually attracts water birds like ducks and herons. So this particular airport, through their investigations, could then identify the key wildlife attractions on their airfield, include that in their management plan, and then use that to target their management. Next slide, please. But it's not just identifying the wildlife attractions on the airfield. For many aerodromes, it's what is happening on the other side of the perimeter fence that may be contributing the most wildlife and contributing the most to the strike risk at that particular airport. So at this same airport here in Australia, again, starting down the bottom left-hand side and moving in a clockwise direction, there is a putrescible waste landfill, so a landfill that receives residential waste, urban waste, so food waste, which is particularly attractive to a number of scavenging birds. Above that, we have a lake, which was a quarry that had been disused many years ago and filled with water. That lake alone is significantly attractive to large populations of ducks and swans, all of which are a particular hazard to aircraft. Beyond that lake, just to the north of that, there is an extensive forested area that contains a high proportion of plant species that attract a lot of parrots and fruit bats, or what we refer to as flying foxes. And then over to the east of the airfield, there is a tidal estuary, which, depending on the tidal regime at the time, high or low tide, it does provide habitat for a range of migratory birds and shorebirds and flocking birds. Below that, there is an aquaculture farm, which is particularly attractive to raptors and other fish-eating birds. And then there is a large field next to the airfield there that has cattle that is grazed there, which in itself is a particularly attractive land use. So for this particular airport, identifying those off-airport hazards increases their awareness, allows them to incorporate into their wildlife hazard management plan their approach to monitoring and managing those particular hazards. And we also recognise that for certainly a lot of airports here in Australia, it's the off-airport land use and the off-airport attractants that are a particular issue. Next slide, please. Australian airports also have to include in their WHMPs a series of procedures that monitor and assess and manage their wildlife, and the regulation requires airports to have these procedures relating to how they detect hazards, how they monitor those hazards, how they assess their risk and analyse their risk assessment results, but also procedures relating to how they communicate hazards to pilots, whether that is through the aeronautical information package, whether it's through NOTAMs, whether it's direct communication with air traffic control, or whatever other means of communicating hazards that particular airport has in place. And the plan also should include procedures for mitigating those risks. So that generally includes a range of active measures such as dispersal and harassment, lethal control, egg and nest removal, and a range of passive measures relating to habitat management such as water management or waste management. Yes, next slide, please. So I have here just an example of a standard operating procedure that a lot of Australian airports would have a similar version of this. Key to the standard operating procedures is not just the actual list of responsibilities and roles, but also making sure that the procedure has reference to things like safety, any safety requirements for implementing that procedure, any supporting documentation, and what the legal requirements are for that standard operating procedure, the allocation of responsibilities for who should be implementing that particular procedure and in what capacity, and then of course the instructions on how to implement it. So this particular one is related to bird counts, and it's a step-by-step instruction on how the airport safety officer can complete those bird counts. Yep, next slide, please. For this particular airport, they also have supporting documentation in their SOP related to how the airport is divided into their bird count sectors. Next slide, please. And also their wildlife count form. So it's an all-inclusive procedure that tells them who's doing what they should be doing, and how they can record the outcomes of implementing that procedure. Next slide, please. The fourth key inclusion for WHMPs by Australian Airports here is how they describe their liaison arrangements with the local planning authorities up to 13 kilometres within the airfield. Now, as I've already mentioned, off-airport land uses, depending what they are, can be particularly attractive to wildlife and particularly problematic for airports because it's usually outside of their management jurisdiction. So that coordination and communication with the local planning authorities and the local land users can be really critical. So here in Australia, airports are guided by the National Airport Safeguarding Framework. Thank you. Can you click that again for me? And this is a national guideline. It's not a recommendation. It's a national guideline for land users and land use planning authorities within 13 kilometres of an airfield on the types of land uses that are considered attractive to wildlife. You can see that on the left-hand column there's a series of land uses. The second column describes the level of risk that particular land use can contribute. And then the next three columns recommends the actions for those land uses within 3 and 8 and 13 kilometre radius of the airfield. And that's for those land uses that are already in place. The last three columns in that table talks about the actions recommended for those land uses when they're only proposed, so when they haven't actually been established as yet. And you can see that there's a range of actions recommended, from incompatible, in that they wouldn't be recommended at all, to mitigate, applying some sort of measures to manage the wildlife activity on that particular land use, or to monitor. Or in some instances, no action is required, depending on the land use and depending on its location relative to the airfield. So that's the national guideline for Australian airports. Next slide, please. Another way that airports liaise with the local planning authorities and land users is through their wildlife committees. If you could click on that again for me. And wildlife committees that are generally chaired and coordinated by the airport obviously include key elements of the airport operations themselves, but can include a range of off-airport stakeholders, whether that be local waste management authorities, the planning authorities, and even state or federal government, depending on the nature of the land use. The wildlife committees, those forums, provide a really effective means of identifying off-airport issues and finding a coordinated approach to managing and mitigating any risks that those land uses present. Next slide, please. And in some instances, there are land use planning requirements embedded into land use planning frameworks. If you could, next one for me, thank you. This, for example, is a document for, in Australia, the state of Queensland. There are actual requirements for airports to adhere to relating to safeguarding airports, adopting the principles of identifying and managing land uses within 13 kilometres of an airport. This is purely a state requirement, not a national requirement. Next slide, please. So the wildlife hazard management plans prepared by the airport also need to set out the airport's approach or their strategy to wildlife hazard reduction or wildlife hazard management, and that strategy should explain how the airport is approaching wildlife hazard management. It should, in theory, align with the airport safety management system, and it should also include a review and continuous improvement process that Andrew already referred to earlier on. But it also can take the form of objectives, targets, or key performance indicators. Next slide, please. For example, here, this is an airport that has in place, this is just a small snapshot of their key performance indicators. But just to give you an idea of the sorts of targets and objectives that an airport might have in place. If we look at the first objective, they're related to the regulatory requirements. The objective is to develop and implement procedures and systems that comply with the regulatory framework. So that's the objective. They then have a target, in this instance, to continually improve to meet the compliance. They have established a performance indicator for that, so the airport can measure their performance against that target and that objective, and they have identified the sorts of evidence where they would find how they're progressing against that particular indicator, and any particular references to standard operating procedures that are linked to that. So this is just a very small example of how an airport might establish their strategy, and this then allows them to critically review and assess their wildlife hazard management plan and program to ensure that it is moving in the direction that they require it to be. Next slide, please. Another inclusion into the WHMP is a detailed understanding and list of who's actually implementing that particular management plan in terms of what their qualifications are and how they are responsible for implementing elements of that WHMP. This can take the form of a very, very simple table of the name, the position, the qualifications, and or experience of those particular personnel. Next slide, please. Now, here in Australia, Australian airports are very fortunate to have access to a WHMP template that can help guide them to develop their own template. And this is available on the Australian Aviation Wildlife Hazard Group website. If you could just click that video for me. Just press play or press next slide. And this will actually show you that it's available on the website in the resources section, and there's the template there. The idea with this is to make sure that Australian airports satisfy all the requirements of the regulations, but it's also helping them to make sure that they have something in place that is consistent and something that is adaptable to their particular operations. If you could just click on the next slide for me. And this is, I'm not going to go in the full detail of this, but this is the template there, and you can see that there are various sections that have been established in order for airports to populate it with their own particular information, their own particular procedures, their own particular risks, and it really provides airports with a good foundation to develop their wildlife hazard management plan, because it's the airports, obviously, depending on the size of the operation, will depend on what that plan looks like in the end. But the idea with this template is that it sets people in the right direction. Okay, that was all Andrew and I had to discuss on preparing the wildlife hazard management plan. We're now going to hand it over to Anthony Conti from Sydney Airport, who will talk about what's involved with actually implementing those plans. Thank you, Tony.
Thank you, Kylie. Morning, good afternoon, everyone. As Kylie mentioned, I'll be presenting how to implement a wildlife management plan here at Sydney Airport. One comment I'd like to make is that wildlife management is probably one of the most difficult areas to manage at an aerodrome. We will never eliminate strikes altogether, but we'll strive to minimise number of strikes, and that really entails continuous monitoring of the airfield of any wildlife or presence of wildlife on the airfield. So you simply can't take your eye off wildlife at an airport. It's one of those areas that just will never go away whilst we have aircraft landing and taking off at an aerodrome. Next slide, please. So it's important to ensure that staff know their roles and responsibilities. So one of the areas that is quite important is to have competent staff who are trained in wildlife management, and this is key to implementing a wildlife management plan. In particular, without trained staff, they simply won't have a good understanding of what the wildlife will do on an airfield, what their behaviour is, and certainly this all comes through identifying bird species that are listed in SOPs, or if you may have a database that has all the different bird species that have been identified at your airport, and certainly what we have is we have what we call a species action plan. So some of the species that are considered high and medium risk, we have an action plan in place for each in particular species. Staff should have an understanding of how to use the database, so how to enter the data that they've collected when they've done their wildlife counts. Certainly staff should be trained in the use of firearms or pyrotechnics. I understand there might be some aerodromes that may not be permitted to use firearms or pyrotechnics. So it's then looking at some other habituation tools that you may use, like a vehicle mounted gas cannon or a stock whip. So these are certainly some different tools that we use here in Sydney, and they can be very effective if you're not using a firearm. The next one would be also ensuring that the staff actually have refresher training. So we at Sydney do refresher training every 2 years. We bring in our ornithologist and to undertake that refresher training. It's a 1 day training course. We covered different areas that we believe that the staff should be retrained in. So certainly the staff get a lot out of that refresher training. Also, the other area is understanding your stakeholders. So you do have airline pilots, hoping that they're actually reporting all strikes if they're known, and also working with air traffic control. So we find that we get told of strikes through air traffic control, and obviously they've been advised by the pilot. So it's important that they actually advise of report all strikes that may have occurred. For every strike that we get advised of, we undertake a runway inspection immediately to determine whether if there is a confirmed strike, whether there is a carcass sitting on the runway, and removing that carcass immediately. Your ornithologist, if you have an ornithologist engaged, they are really important in helping you manage wildlife. They certainly are able to review the data that's collected. They undertake independent monthly surveys. So that's certainly independent of your own current wildlife counts that safety officers may perform each day. We undertake 2 to 3 wildlife counts each day. So, and the independent monthly surveys are carried out 3 times a month. So it's just a bit of a, it gives an independent view. And also it gives the ornithologist the opportunity to provide some on-field training to the staff. So when they come out to do their surveys, staff who are actually rostered on will also go out with the ornithologist, and it's an opportunity to gain some more insight into in how to manage wildlife on the aerodrome. Next slide, please. So reporting and data collection. So at Sydney, I've listed all our standard operating procedures that you see there on the slide. So we deal with livestock transfer. So that's we do have some livestock, and we do have racing horses that come through Sydney Airport. We look at wildlife monitoring, our serviceability inspections, wildlife hazard surveillance. So it talks about routine patrols and recording bird activity. Our harassment techniques under wildlife dispersal. If there is a need to cull birds, and that's generally through if there's a threat to the safety of aircraft, we undertake culling, but it's not our first option. It's always about harassing and ensuring that the birds don't become settled on the airfield. So, but as I said earlier, if there is a genuine threat to aircraft safety, we will certainly use culling. And birds can be quite persistent, so it is another option for us to use if needed. And our wildlife strike reporting. So we do report all strikes, whether they're confirmed or unconfirmed. It's a mandatory requirement to our Air Transport Safety Bureau, and we have a gas cannon. So if we're introducing any new technology, we will always prepare a new standard operating procedure for that particular technology. We certainly won't introduce that until the SOP is developed and a risk assessment is undertaken to ensure that staff who use that particular technology understand how to use it and it is safe to use on the airfield. We also record and report all bird and animal strikes, so that's confirmed and or suspected as part of our wildlife strike reporting. We identify locations where the bird counts will be conducted. So we do have various areas marked on the ground. We have a map that's included in the SOP, which shows you the 21 locations that we have where bird counts are undertaken. So that's quite important if you want consistency for all your wildlife staff. They know exactly where the counts need to be undertaken at what location. Without that, people would be unsure as to where the bird counts would need to be done each day. And the next one is on identifying your high and medium risk species and targeting management actions towards them. So that's quite important, because if you don't really target those high and medium risk species, they potentially are the ones that cause most of the damage to aircraft. What we found is most of this low risk species, ones that may not frequently come to the aerodrome, they're very small in size, will not necessarily cause damage to aircraft. Next slide, please. So reviewing data collected and investigations. So we review our data monthly. Our ornithologist prepares quarterly, half-yearly, yearly data where we are provided with reports. We review those reports and then we update the risk profiles to see if there has been any change to the high and medium risk species. This would be based on certainly the number of strikes, the number of wildlife presence on the aerodrome as well. That certainly does change from time to time. I would suspect that each year when we undertake the review of the wildlife management plan, that those high and risk medium species would actually change in terms of their profile. In terms of investigations, we undertake investigations when we have a multiple or damaging strike, and any recommendations or corrective actions out of that investigation are then put back into training and also through our SOPs. So staff are aware of what changes may need to be done in terms of our the way we manage wildlife on the airfield. It might relate to when we do our mowing. So it's important that the recommendation and corrective actions are communicated back to the staff that are actually managing the wildlife each day. Next slide, please. Kylie did touch on just understanding your airport environment. So when you're preparing your wildlife management plan, it's good to understand both your environment airside and also your environment outside, and that does contribute. They do go hand in hand. It does contribute to the number of wildlife that you will see on the airport. So one of the things that we often look at is the food sources. What's providing? Like, birds won't come to the airfield if they're not looking for a particular food source. So in both fauna on and off airport, we do have some species that transit across the airfield, so not necessarily come to the airfield to look for food, but they might be heading towards a couple of ponds that we have situated off airport. They might even look at heading towards any waste transfer stations or rubbish tips. So it's important to understand your airport environment off airport, whether that's the reason why you're having a number of strikes due to to birds actually transiting across the aerodrome. The next one is they will look for shelter. So if there's any roosting and nesting opportunities, they will always use those, especially if you've got some raptor birds. They often do roost and looking for their next prey. You need to know where these locations are, and there might be some times where you might be able to put some effective management tools in place, like bird spikes or whatever, to certainly reduce those roosting areas. And trees, depending on which trees, they actually become a nesting opportunity for birds as well. Water is quite important for birds, so that also becomes a food source. Water bodies such as ponds and bays or lakes. We're surrounded at the southern end of the aerodrome with quite a large bay. We do have a couple of water bodies such as ponds, one on airport which is netted, and another is certainly an old pond that used to be the original water supply for most of Sydney. The other thing to consider is grass management, netting of open drains and ponds, which I just spoke about earlier, your waste management, overflowing bins and poor waste management could be by your own stakeholders or tenants. Landscaping, this is also another, can be another issue depending what species you may have planted over a number of years. They do become a food source for various types of birds, and also fences, so preventing wildlife from entering the airside. We recently did an upgrade to a number of fences at the airport, and what we see in that photo there, you've actually got quite a robust steel fence with a concrete foundation. And what we've seen since we've actually introduced that type of fencing is the number of rabbits has reduced significantly entering the airside. So it's made a significant difference to the number of rabbits that we were used to previously. So it's been quite effective putting in that type of fence. Next slide, please. Working with local authorities, I know Kylie did touch on this, is your wildlife working group or your committees, your wildlife committees. That's certainly quite important in understanding what local authorities might be doing in their area and what they may be planning for the future. They might be introducing some large landscape areas. So it's quite important to stay in touch with those local authorities if you do hold those wildlife committees, or if you have regular meetings with local authorities, as I said, that gives you an opportunity to get an update on any future developments. And it's not a bad idea to also maybe provide a letter to your local council planners by just reminding them that if there are any future developments that potentially may be an attractant to birds or wildlife, that they actually advise you and maybe send you some information regarding those particular developments. Next slide, please. Thank you very much. I'll pass on to Simon.
Thank you, Tony. I hope everyone can hear me. So first, I'd like to thank Punya Shakya for the invitation to speak at this forum, and more importantly, the introduction from Ash McAlpine from the AAWHG. I've only recently been involved in this group and have learnt a lot in the last 6 months. What's more interesting is how my airline group has suddenly found a new desire to get more deeply involved in the management of wildlife and also interacting more with the airports. So part of this presentation and response to how airlines respond to WHMPs is also part of the learning journey that Qantas as a group airline has come through over the last couple of years. Next slide, please. So airlines, ultimately, you know, we're a little bit selfish. We think that the management of wildlife is all about us. It's about safety. It's about having a safe environment to operate in. It's about safety for our aircraft, safety for our passengers, and also safety for our equipment. So what do we expect from airports? We're looking for a safe and reliable operating environment where the airport operator has effective risk management in place. As well as that, we're looking for timely sharing of relevant information to maintain those safe operations. Now, this is great to say, but unless the airlines actively get involved with each of the airports, this doesn't happen. And this doesn't always happen to the best of our ability. So we're making a change, and particularly through the participation and awareness of the AAWHG, all of the major airlines are starting to see a need to get more involved, particularly coming off the slowdown in flying operations that has been, at least in our region, the impact from this COVID concern around the world. Next slide, please. So over time, we haven't been as active in airport wildlife management, and that has greatly reduced over the last couple of years. As part of the COVID slowdown, even though we still had a limited flying network operating, we actually noticed an increase in strike rate per flight. And up until that point, we followed the mandatory reporting for near misses and wildlife strikes. We looked regularly at the data from the ATSB. We tracked our own sort of data to a point, but we never really had a system in place. But it was noticed by all of the airlines within the Qantas group that for the number of flights that we were operating, we were having far more animal strikes and bird strikes than before. And we realised we didn't have enough data to try and actually make some sense of this. So in December 2018, it was decided at a group level that we were going to carry out an audit of both our internal procedures and a select number of airports that we operate to, covering both regional and major airports, to try and understand why we were seeing an increase in wildlife strikes, and one of the key findings that came from that audit was that we need to be more involved with airports and the wildlife management plans. So up until now, this presentation has focused on how to put a plan in place. So what I'm really talking about now is, what do you do with that plan, and how do you engage with the operators and the other stakeholders to actually get the feedback and make the most of that data? So as a result of that, we've set up inside the Qantas AOC a group level committee, and that's our means of coordinating our internal wildlife management, but also our interaction with the rest of the industry, the airports, and specifically this industry body. Next slide, please. So over COVID, we, as an operator, we spent a lot of time, like every other airline around the world, placing our fleets into storage and shutting down our networks. And I'm not sure if everyone's aware, but over the last 2 years, I have seen the most revisions from all the OEMs, all the aircraft manufacturers, to their maintenance programs than in the last 10 to 15 years, because of all the sudden discoveries about what animals do with aircraft when they're parked for a long time all around the world in different environments. And almost every other week, there were revisions from the manufacturers saying, you need to inspect here, you need to look here, you need to check for this, you need to check for that. It was constant. And we were discovering not just the occasional, oh, there's a nest in the wheel well, but we were discovering that the animals around our aircraft and the wildlife around our aircraft were learning new habits and new tricks because we weren't flying. The airports were quiet. It was a nice place to be. And like I said before, animals like was pointed out before by Kylie, that everyone's looking for shelter. So we noticed an increase in nesting in places we would never even dream of before. An increase in invasive bugs, mud wasps, etc., and animals getting into places where we'd never contemplate. Snakes in wheel wells, aircraft, birds going into flaps and ailerons where they were drooping over time and small little holes appearing. And they were learning not only when we, over time, but it got to the point where an aircraft in transit, when we were starting to operate, was on the ground for 4 hours and we had a report of bird nesting. And this particular aircraft, that was 4 hours. And it was only spotted by a little tell of straw and keen observation from someone on the ground that they noticed bird activity around the aileron. So, yes, as an operator, it put a lot of challenges in place, and it made us think, what do we need to do in interacting with the aerodromes and the airfields to try and improve the lot and the management of wildlife on the ground. Next slide, please. So, as you would know, Australia has been quite fortunate in how we're recovering in an aviation sense from this COVID conflict, and more importantly, we're now operating almost at 80% of our previous domestic capacity. But as part of that, we've actually increased flying to new airports and to regional airfields where we wouldn't normally take large aircraft. As part of that, we're having to engage now with a lot more airfield operators to understand the risks at these new destinations, and more importantly, feed that into our pilots and our technical crew and our network to understand how we manage this. We are flying in a very sort of dynamic environment at the moment, where just to try and keep the aircraft operating rather than storing them. We're coming up with new network routes every 2 to 3 weeks where there's an opportunity or a demand for a large aircraft, a large RPT aircraft to fly into a regional city that we would never contemplate. The result of this is a different environment for the airfields to have different type of aircraft operating in their space, and not necessarily in all cases having an agile plan that can take into account when large aircraft come through. So we're reconnecting with the airports. So across the group, Qantas is leveraging off all of our subsidiary AOCs, and we're putting in place now a plan to engage with all of the airfields we operate into, and working towards getting more involved in their local wildlife management plans so that we can add our data, add our observations, and add our experiences into those plans so that we can work together to achieve a safer outcome. And in a safety management sort of system perspective, this is closing the loop on when you have a plan, how do you follow up to know that it's working. So what we're doing with that is we'll be utilising our networks across the airports and taking it more of a group-wide focus on getting involved in the airports. The final thing that we're looking for is we're continuing and wanting to continue to maintain a higher level of management oversight through this formation of the committee to steer the wildlife management across the group. It's not something we can afford to lose sight of now, and was one of the key things that we thought was necessary as part of our risk assessment for returning to a COVID world flying, where we've come from such a state of slow flying. And like I said, I think the animals have learnt new habits, and the wildlife has learnt new habits, and we need to take that into account now. Next slide. To enable our view across all of our operators and to have a better understanding of what's happening with wildlife, we're turning to the guidance of both this the AAWHG recommendations on how to track this data, but we're engaging across all of our group to standardise how we collect our data and looking at ways to share it in a more dynamic real-time environment. What we want to do is make it easier for our pilots and ground staff, because we look at wildlife interactions not just in air, bird strike or near misses, but also what our observations are on the ground. So we want to make that reporting easier, and we want to make that reporting visible across the group. Importantly, as we move through this process and as we learn more, we want to share our data with the wider industry and get a better understanding across the entire operations and all the airports, so that everyone benefits from a safer flying environment. On the page there is an example of a Power BI slide that is being used to oversight our wildlife interactions across all of our operators. And it's got some pretty pictures and some colours, but it helps us to identify in this particular case on a wildlife interaction per 1,000 flights where our areas of concern are, which give us the basic data to come to the airfields and say, we're seeing this, what are you seeing? And then we can actually share with the airfields our information to actually help both of us, both the operator of the aircraft and the operator of the airfield, to achieve a safer outcome. So this is still in its infancy. We've been working on this for the last 6 months, but going forward, we see the greater sharing of data between operators and airfields to be an essential part of the continuing improvement of these wildlife hazard management plans and the improvement of safety for the flying public. Now, as an example, I don't know if we can zoom the screen. I can zoom the screen on mine. The particular event on the screen, if you can zoom on your own screen and have a look, it talks about, while backtracking on runway 11, a kitten was observed running across the runway and stopping to the left of centerline. So that wouldn't be a bird strike, but that would be a very expensive engine rebuild if that poor kitten was ingested into an engine on taxi or on takeoff. So we're looking, and I want everyone in the industry to think a little bit broader about, this is about wildlife interaction with aircraft, whether the aircraft be resting or flying or taxiing or moving around. And that hopefully is something that will be taken into account in the wildlife management plans going forward across the industry. So next slide, please. That is at the end of the presentation at the moment. So I'll hand the floor back to Punya, and we'll see how we proceed from here. Thank you very much for your attention.
So now we would like to have a half an hour break. So in order to have a precise time, I think let's come back at 11:15 Bangkok time, which will allow you 35 minutes of break. And let me give you some announcement how to join Pigeonhole for the question and answers. So you have to, still not sharing, right?
Not yet.
Okay.
Not yet.
Okay, from your computer or mobile, please using Chrome or Internet Explorer, please type pigeonhole.at, and then it will ask enter passcode. So you have to put the passcode ICAO AAWHG, or you can scan the barcode. Then it will take you to ICAO AAWHG Wildlife Hazard Management webinar. And there is a question and answers, question for all sessions. And then you can type your questions. And we will come back at 11:15 Bangkok time, and then we will start the question and answer sessions. So thank you very much. See you at 11:15 Bangkok time. Sorry, probably I might have put my microphone muted. So all the speaker, could you please put on your camera? Yes, thank you very much. So now I will display the questions and select one by one depending on the number of votes we have received. So let me select first question which has got the 4 words. This is from Sanjay Kumar. What are the major changes faced by Sydney Airport in wildlife hazard management program, and why the bird strike rate gets increased during COVID-19 while flight movements decreases? Tony, probably you would be the most appropriate person to answer this question.
I think until we can confirm Tony's back on the line, do you want to move to the next question and we'll come back?
Right, okay.
Sorry, Punya, I'm here.
Oh, okay, Tony.
Yep, apologies.
Please go ahead, yeah.
So what we found was that pre-COVID, so with pre-COVID, you'll find that the actual birds got used to the number of aircraft at the aerodrome, and so some of the birds are quite smart. So because there was the presence of a lot more aircraft during pre-COVID, one of the challenges we faced was when there was a significant reduction in the number of aircraft, we found that birds become a little bit complacent. So you may find that with juvenile birds, they weren't used to having large presence of aircraft, but then obviously during COVID there was a small number, so they weren't used to actually seeing aircraft, and so what we were finding was that we were seeing an increased number of strikes, even though we didn't reduce our monitoring. We didn't reduce the number of staff. We were still out there monitoring the airfield. We even went to a point where, because we have 2 parallel runways, one of the runways was not in use, so we closed down one of the runways, and then if air traffic control needed to use that runway again, what we introduced was we introduced a runway inspection prior to them using the runway. So this way, if there were flocks of birds sitting on the runway, we would be able to move the flocks of birds on and certainly reduce any type of any risk of a bird strike, because that runway was not being used for a long period of time. And when they wanted to reopen it, we certainly didn't want an aircraft landing on a runway with a flock of birds. So so we had to sort of change our strategy a little bit in terms of dealing with the bird strikes, but that's one of the main reasons, is that the birds weren't used to the reduced number of aircraft movements, hence why we were seeing more bird strikes.
Thank you, Tony. I hope Mr. Sanjay Kumar and those who have supported these questions are happy. So next questions from Mr. DCL Karna, who is the chair of Wildlife Hazard Management Working Group. Would you please elaborate type of electronic mechanical devices has been using at Australian airports to detect and deter the birds and other wildlife? So who would like to answer this question?
I can start, Punya, again. We don't use any electronic devices. We have trialled them. We find them not very successful. We mainly stick to, when I say mechanical device, we have a gas cannon, We have a number of different tools in our, if you want to call it our toolkit, such as firearms, pyrotechnics, stock whip. We have a distress caller. We have the gas cannon. So we find that we need to use a number of those tools because we don't want birds to become habituated. So certainly we've tried laser devices. We find them to be unsuccessful. So we're finding that the traditional methods being used over a number of years are actually quite useful in certainly dispersing birds, and as I said in my presentation, if culling is required, we will sometimes use culling, but certainly the tools we use for dispersal have been very effective.
If I can just add to that, Tony, the airports are really only limited by the resources available to them in terms of the sorts of tools that they can use. As Tony said, a variety of tools is needed to reduce birds getting used to any one particular tool, and if a bird habituates or get used to one particular tool, then that tool becomes completely useless. So relying on only one or two different types of devices would be recommended. Using a variety of tools in a variety of ways, as Tony said, stock whips, gas cannons, distress callers, pretty much anything that can make a noise, but even physical presence of someone, whether that's in a vehicle or whether it's just someone walking towards the birds. More elaborate and more complex tools could be things like trained dogs or falcons, raptors. They're quite successful on a particular group of birds. But I think that the key is there's no one device that you can just set it up and forget about it, press a button, walk away, and it will keep all your birds away. That sort of silver bullet does not exist. The only way to stop birds and planes hitting each other is to stop planes, pretty much. So the key is lots of different tools in lots of different ways, and it doesn't have to be expensive electronic devices. I have seen photos of safety officers at Beijing Airport in China walking around with gongs to make a noise. Here in Australia, the use of the stock whip or the bull whip is particularly effective as well. And they're very simple, very cheap tools that can be used.
And I might just jump in there as well, and just I suppose the second part of that is the detection. Now, detection devices aren't commonly used in Australia, simply because we don't face the sort of, I suppose, the same challenges as some of the people in the Northern Hemisphere do with big flocks of migratory birds and the like. So there has been sort of trials looked at around using weather systems to track large flocks of flying foxes in Australia are a big one, but I suppose the need for them at this stage and the outcome of having those detection systems probably doesn't justify the costs and those sorts of things at this stage. But yeah, everyone's always sort of looking to get a bit of an advantage or edge, in jumping out ahead of these safety issues.
And then, Punya, if I could just round out what the others have said, and especially what Andrew's just said, reference detection. I'd encourage people to never underestimate the value of just having a person present on the airfield, right in near the runway, near those critical zones. Is going back a few years now, but I was operating at an airfield, and after some very significant flooding, and no matter what we said to anybody, we were not able to get any more equipment or any more money to do the things that we wanted. But by simply having a vehicle out there with a person, you're able to relay the information to air traffic control firsthand, and not rely on them seeing it when the tower could be 3 kilometres away from that landing threshold. And so, putting a person there to detect and then report the hazard was what we could do at the time, and it made quite a bit of difference as well. So detection doesn't have to be multi-million-dollar radar system. Detection could be, you know, somebody whose job is to keep their eyes open and report things.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Tony, Kylie, Andrew, and Ash. I hope Mr. Karna and other colleagues are happy with the answers. I think a working group is also developing some regional guidance material regarding these issues that will be discussed from tomorrow's meetings. So those who are participating in the meeting will have an opportunity to hear from the presenter. So thank you very much. So next, this is from Indonesia, Sadikin. We observed that with significant flight reduction in most airports, I think this is very similar to what we had in the question number 1. If anybody would like to supplement to the answer provided by Tony, maybe you can add here. Otherwise, we can skip this question because answer has been already given in the previous question. Is that okay? Okay, thank you. Next question from Mr. Dong. Seagulls often appear in the early morning of the rainy seasons at Phu Quoc International Airport. They are very brave. So what should we do to destroy or catch them to reduce the danger to aircraft? So who would like to answer to these questions?
I can start off addressing that one. So I can only speak to the seagulls that we have here in Australia, not the ones that you have in Vietnam, but I would assume that their behaviour and ecology is quite similar. If they're arriving early morning, the first thing we would recommend is that you have your safety team, your wildlife controllers out as they're arriving for the day to disperse. The more you can discourage them getting settled for the day, the less they're likely to want to hang around. So dispersing them as they're arriving in the morning. Seagulls are particularly tricky. They're very persistent, and so your dispersal and your active control needs to be equally persistent until they have moved off to a location that is what you would consider to be a more acceptable location. The attraction on airfields for seagulls is particularly during the wet season. Obviously there's a lot of water that's accumulated, but also during really inclement weather. So if it's really stormy weather, airports can offer a bit of a refuge for gulls, and they're really just looking for somewhere safe to rest for the day out of the path of any storms in the area. And this is one of the reasons why airports are attractive to gulls. So dispersing as they arrive will help to reinforce that the airport isn't where they should be. Seagulls are also particularly curious birds. They tend to move towards danger to see what it is. So, for example, one of the things that's used very effectively is the distress signal, which has pre-recorded sounds of birds in distress. Most birds will hear those calls and they will actually move away from the sound, whereas the curiosity of seagulls are more likely to. So if some sort of distress call or even any other unusual sound was to be played, you could use that in a way to draw them out of areas that you don't want them to be. But I think the bigger picture of this is looking at not just what's happening while they're on the airfield, but looking at what's around the airfield. Seagulls Many species of seagulls are scavengers, so if they have access to waste, that's going to encourage their breeding and their establishment of their population. We wouldn't generally recommend. We wouldn't necessarily recommend catching and culling gulls as a standalone option. Certainly, removing birds from population can be effective, but you need to supplement that with managing their resources, managing their food, and applying that regular persistent dispersal on the airfield. I hope that gives you something to go on, Mr. Dom. Did anyone have anything else to add to that?
I might just briefly add something from a wildlife perspective, and then I can throw to you, Tony, if that's all right. But exactly right, Colleen. I think the sort of two fundamentals there is looking at creating within the airport where you can control is creating a negative zone for them within there. So that's looking at obviously altering their behaviour and making that site as unattractive as possible to them. So looking at why they're potentially attracted to the site and seeing if you can reduce that attractiveness. But then also, if you can't reduce that attractiveness, which you know may or may not be able to, is really looking to like train the birds and change their behaviour. Exactly like Kylie said, is being as persistent as they are or more. So you can train that behaviour into them, and that bleeds exactly into Tony's discussion around Sydney Airport and the increase of strikes and those sorts of things. You can see how quickly that wildlife will alter their behaviour. Its persistence is the key, and basically, keeping their behaviour how you want it, and creating those negative zones around the airport is key for active wildlife management.
Yeah, I agree with what you said, Andrew, and just extending on that, what we found was that if you destroy the birds, as what Kylie pointed out, they become very curious. They see that what's happened to their friends, so they sort of hang around a lot longer because they're curious to see what's happened to their friends. So we certainly discourage destroying the seagulls, and sometimes there's just too many. So the active being very persistent in dispersing them, they'll eventually will move on, and they'll look for a safe haven when they do move on. So sometimes they will likely to come back to the area. So it's not about just moving them on to a location which might be away from the critical areas like runway strips. It's making sure that they just move on to another location, or just fly in an opposite direction away from the airports. But it does take a fair amount of work. So, but being persistent is really the key to moving them on. We found the distress caller to be quite useful. Again, moving them from, say, the critical area, the runway strip, to a location which you think would be suitable, and then once as Kylie pointed out, they're curious, they're hearing maybe one of their colleagues in distress, so they'll come and certainly circle around that area. And once they do, you can actually then use some dispersal techniques to then move them on to another location. So again, we found that to be very effective.
Thank you, Kylie, Andrew, and Tony. I hope Vietnam is happy to hear the answer from our speakers. So let's move on to the next questions. This is from IFALPA, Mr. Notawat. As there are many stakeholders regarding the wildlife hazard management, how should the runway safety team be involved with the wildlife hazard management program? So who would like to take this question?
Thank you, Punya. I'll take this one, and thanks IFALPA for the question, and an excellent question, and also a great opportunity to also bring up runway safety. So thank you. I guess I answer here from first-hand experience because I'm also the rapporteur of the National Runway Safety Group that we have in Australia, which we found due to the diversity and the size of our country that we needed to actually have a national body to help coordinate some of the effort on runway safety rather than just relying on local runway safety teams at individual airports. The work of a local runway safety team is directly complementary to the work of a local wildlife hazard management group and vice versa. When you look at the global priorities, global safety priorities from ICAO, and with runway safety being one of those, and within that you've got runway excursion as being one of the leading causes of runway safety related incidents. One of the major contributing factors to runway excursion in many cases is wildlife strike, or can be attributed towards wildlife strike in a diagram. So whilst they're not exclusively the same group or the same meeting, definitely they're complementary. Depending on the, and as a safety management specialist, depending on the size and the complexity of your aerodrome that you're talking about is actually where you would then look at whether, for instance, these could be accommodated into the one meeting, but they're slightly different agenda items, or whether you've actually got a separate one. So there's a couple of airports in Australia who do this particularly well. One that I can think of that actually has separate meetings, but you get to see the same people mostly at both of them, with a little bit more possibly science and science management at one side of it, and in the other one a little bit more from the operator side of things. And there's another airport I can think of who actually combines the two subjects into the one meeting. So I applaud both of those because they have designed their meeting structure suitable for how they do business. But looking at it, so how should the runway safety team be involved in the wildlife hazard management program? Very actively. So they should be actually part of the answer. They should be the ones encouraging all parts of the airport community, not just the airport operator, but also the ANSP, the aircraft operators, even the training institutions to become involved, and in fact, even maintenance. And we heard earlier from Simon when he was talking about the different activities there, remembering that wildlife includes things like birds nesting in aircraft or wasps and things like this as well. So maintenance have got a big part to play as well. So Punya, has that answered the question, do you think, sufficiently?
I think so. Tony, would you like to supplement something? Because you are actively working in this area at the Sydney airport.
Yes, so yes, Punya, at our runway safety team meeting, we often present some of the data to the actual group themselves. So because not everyone has visibility of some of the strikes and certainly the data that we've actually collected over a period of say 3 or 4 months. So it's an opportunity to present that to a number of the stakeholders like the airlines and ATC. So it's an opportunity to get their input and their insight into what we're seeing from an aerodrome operator's point of view in terms of wildlife, and also seek feedback from them in terms of what sort of actions that we could certainly take to assist them.
Thank you, Ash. Thank you, Tony. I hope Mr. Natawan and the participants are happy from the answer from you. Actually, IFALPA is very active in our working group also, and also contributing to develop the regional guidance from the regional perspective. So let's move on to the next questions. So next questions from Indonesia, very interesting questions. Can you share how in the very beginning AAWHG starts your consolidations and establishing your working group that can support your government? As now Indonesian team in a roadmap to establish national working group as well. So who would like to start first? Okay, Ash.
Thanks, Punya, and thank you, Sadikin, my friend, for this question. I know we've spoken on this topic privately before. The first thing I would say is nobody should sit back and wait for a rule or a law to be passed to say you must do some of these things. The evidence is there that doing something is better than nothing. And in fact, where we're trying to go with legislation in Australia to performance-based regulation and outcomes-based things is to actually look at what you're wanting to achieve. If we look back at where the AAWHG came from, and we go back to 2003, so nearly 20 years ago, there was no direct government mandate. There was definitely no rules or laws. It wasn't, in fact, the government that even said, let's do this. It was a group of industry participants from all different domains who said, you know what, we should actually start talking about this stuff. And if we're all together, we can generate better outcomes than if we try and do this as individuals. So that's where the group sort of came from. Along the way, the group has gathered members and at times lost some members and then gathered them again on the way through. And for instance, you saw with Simon, with what he said earlier, that Qantas has got a very much a new vigour in being part of the solution, and I applaud Qantas for the way they're doing that. Along the way, CASA, and from fairly early days, CASA as the Australian regulator has been involved with the AAWHG, but again, there is still no mandate or law per se. 2010, so some years after the group had been established, the federal government in Australia actually recognised the AAWHG though as the peak national body on wildlife or then bird strike. And that's you can even see that document on the AAWHG website, and we refer to that very often because that establishment has then allowed the AAWHG to go a little bit further with its work since then. So what would be my advice to you, Sadikin, in Indonesia, or to any other states who are looking at establishing this, is find like-minded people across the entire industry. So people from your ANSP, people from your operators across various operators, people from your airports or your airport authorities, because I do understand with Indonesia with the different airport authority regions. And again, start getting together and just saying, what can we do that is better than doing nothing? There's a lot of work out there, and I know we would gladly share any of our work from the AAWHG with you, although you'd have to look and see, just confirm that the language was consistent with your processes and if you needed to adapt them at all. But once you start doing that and people start seeing that it's a good group and it's generating good things, you'll then see more and more people come on board and want to support it. I'm not sure if anybody else from the AAWHG would like to offer anything in support there, but again, Sadikin, I'd say just start by doing something, my friend.
Thank you, Ash. I believe Indonesia is very happy with your answer, and we look forward to see Indonesia also develop or establish the similar working group, as Indonesia is a very big country with so many airports and vast airspace, and that will definitely help in the reduction of the wildlife strike in Indonesia. Thank you very much. So let's move on to
Dr. Punya, this is Lalita from World Bird Strike Association. Just adding to AAWHG, we will also, that WBA will also extend guidance to Indonesia.
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much, Ms. Lalita.
Thank you.
For your offer, kind offer. Okay, so next question, coincidentally from also WBA, Ms. Lalita. This is for Qantas. Do you cross-check with the airport operators on the reported strike data you enter? Do you share these reports with the airport operators, and what's the outcome? So I believe, Simon, could you happy to
Thank
answer?
you. Yes, as the only one from Qantas. Lalita, I thank you very much for your question. And the answer is not yet. But the answer is we should be, and we're working towards starting to proactively share our data. As you may be aware, particularly with the regulated collection of airport and bird strike data, that in our country is collected by the ATSB, and they put out a report on the bird strike data and the near miss data on a regular basis, which still is quite sort of after the fact from a data perspective for airports to proactively and operators to proactively react to changing situations. So we're still working towards formalising our data collection and standardising our data collection, and we'll be going into discussions with the ATSB and hopefully all of the airports we work with to start to more proactively share that data in this big data world that we live in. The goal that I have personally, that at the moment is quite well supported by the business and is an interesting challenge, would be to get everyone in the industry who's collecting or seeing this information to share it, so that we can actually have active live safety management of wildlife hazards across all of our operating airports, because that in my mind is the place that we all want to be. We want to fly safe. Businesses like myself or my business, we want to operate without incurring damage and cost, and passengers want to safely get from A to B. So short answer, not yet, but working towards it.
Can I just add one thing to that, Simon? I know a lot of airports that we work with, the airports themselves actually cross-check with the ATSB strike reports in order to make sure that their strike records and their strike history is in an alignment, because often, as you would know, airlines will report a strike directly to the ATSB and the airport might be unaware that it has occurred. So because that strike data is publicly available by the ATSB, airports can regularly cross-check their own records with what the ATSB have, and that sort of helps to build a more robust and comprehensive strike history.
Thank you, Simon. Thanks, Carly. That was really very good information. Thanks.
You're welcome.
And thank you, Lalita, for good questions. So let's move on. We have 3 questions left. I hope our speaker will be happy to answer remaining questions. So next, how we can generate financial resources to carry out wildlife control activities in the vicinity of the airport, beyond the airport perimeter. Good questions. I believe from the government's perspective, Ash would like to answer these questions. Are you happy to answer?
Thanks.
Thank you.
And thank you, Nepal, for the question that you've asked there. And I think some of the others from the team will have something to add afterwards. I guess it goes to, and I'm very empathetic that the perception of how can we do all this and where do we start. But I also even reflect back to the story I told earlier, when no matter who I turned to at my particular airport, nobody would give me anything or any money. But I ended up just sitting out in a car on the airfield doing bits and pieces. However, here we're talking beyond the airport perimeter. I guess what I think of when I look at this is I go, how can we afford not to? Because ultimately, if the worst outcome happens, or maybe not quite the worst, but a bad outcome happens, that somebody's going to end up paying something towards it. So be that for damage to the aeroplane itself, be that delays from an aircraft being sent around or delayed, or be that possibly from rerouting of aircraft and changing schedules, and particularly in locations that are so reliant on tourist type, people coming in and out and generating income for regions. The other thing we have found here, when you talk about beyond the airport perimeter, and I can only talk from our experience here in Australia, and as much as I absolutely love my time in Nepal, I know it's a very different country from Australia. But so often I've also found that people, sometimes they just don't understand what's going on next door to them, for instance. So sometimes it might be having that conversation with the entities and the people outside the perimeter of the airfield and saying, do you understand how you affect things? And so, I understand that, how do we generate financial resources to carry it out? That's a tough one. But also there might be other resources in your region or in your country you could tap into, possibly through the universities and the education system, possibly from other people in the region. Possibly it's not just the airport itself, but talking to the airlines and the other operators in the vicinity of what you could look at there to get some help as well. Anybody else from the group wanting to add anything further to what I've said?
Just a couple of points, Ash. I think in this circumstance, this is where a national committee could be really useful to sort of advocate and push for more resources from the industry as a whole, but also using the wildlife committee, like the airport committee, as the way to connect with and communicate with the off-airport land users. I know we really push airports to engage with their land users off-airport, because two things happen from that. The risk is shared, and it's not solely an airport risk that they have to take on all on their own. And when the risk is coming from beyond the airport perimeter, it's quite a burdensome risk to bear when you can't do much about it. So you're not only sharing the risk by engaging with and working with the land users or the local governments, but there's also the possibility to share the costs of management as well. I know here, for example, lots of examples where, let's say, a landfill had lots of birds on it, there was an airport nearby, it was contributing a significant amount of risk to that particular airport. And the airport and the landfill work together to develop management plans to have dispersal on the landfill, and the landfill themselves actually invested in modifying their waste management practices to reduce the number of birds. So looking at it that it's purely the responsibility and the risk and the cost of the airport, it's not a particularly just or fair position to be in. So if you can share that risk and share that cost, that might be of benefit too.
Thank you, Ash. Thank you, Kylie, for the very good answers to these questions. I hope Nepal is happy. Let's move on to the next questions. Okay, so this is, I think, the difference between wildlife hazard management program and wildlife hazard management plan. What's the difference between two?
I'm happy to jump in there as well, unless everyone's sick of me. Essentially, your plan is your program in a document. So the program is what you do, and the plan it documents what you do. They're not two mutually exclusive things. It's really just the plan is your program, in words, if that makes sense. Anything else to add? Anybody else?
Yeah, the other one, if I could, Kylie, and that's a beautifully eloquent and short answer. And thank you for the question, whoever it is, because it's I see exactly the same question asked in the safety management world about what's the difference between my safety management plan and my safety management system. It's very similar. the answer I've loved to give recently is when you look at competency of a person, competency is not just their knowledge and skills. It's not just the course that they've done. Just like a program is not just simply the words in a document by itself, but the program is also the attitudes and behaviours. The program includes what people are actually doing compared with what is in the document. So you might have a document, and you have to have the document because we have to have some baseline of what is expected, what will be done, what periods it will be done, who will be involved. The program itself includes all the people that are around it, the people that touch that program, that plan, the people that actually are doing the activities, the people that are doing the reporting, the people that are turning up at the meetings. So it's the attitudes and the behaviours, as well as the knowledge and the skills that go into the actual document itself.
Thank you, Kylie, and thank you, Ash. I think this gives more clarifications, the difference between two program and the plan on wildlife hazard management. So I hope we have left the last questions. How to determine the location of a bird strike in airport if only blood stains are found and the pilot didn't know? Question from Indonesia.
Punya, I'll answer the question.
Thank you, Kuda.
Yes, very difficult. You can't, because unless someone has actually observed where the strike may have occurred, it's really difficult to determine the location. So for us, yeah, it'd be great to know the location, but ultimately it is very difficult. So we look at the next step is, okay, let's find out what type of bird it is. So using the DNA process, we'll get the blood stain, get it analysed, and then at least that gives us a bit of information as to what type of bird we looked at that caused this particular strike.
Thank you, Tony, for your good answers for the very difficult questions. Anybody would like to add or supplement?
Yes, Punya.
Thank you, Simon.
I think to take what Tony said, the next step is to also engage more with the airlines to try and narrow down where these type of activities can occur. I mean, without a carcass or an animal to point to, it's very difficult sometimes to identify these strikes, and it could be a case of tracking back to even a couple of ports ago if it wasn't noticed in between flying to an outer port. So there needs to be a lot of cooperation going on, and better cooperation going on between the operators, the maintenance providers, and the airports. And by sharing data, we can hopefully try to track down, firstly, the type of animal, which might help us to narrow it down to a location, and then backtrack the information. So not easy, but hopefully the better we get at sharing information, the easier it will be. But, you know, sometimes you don't see what hits you. Sometimes what you hit doesn't see you.
Yeah, and Brian here, if I could just add that in the next session we'll be talking about DNA, and I think it's also very important to ensure that the DNA is taken. Sometimes when bird remains are on an aircraft, it's easy just to wipe them off and not take the trouble to get the DNA, and I understand all of that, but if we can capture the DNA in exactly the same way that Tony and Simon has got, we've at least being able to trace it back. And I think we've all heard of cases where the bird has come from somewhere considerably far off, and because of the DNA, we've been able to make a very educated guess as to probably where the strike took place.
I'll just extend on that, Brian, and that's true. Like we encountered what we thought was a bird strike here in Sydney. We took some DNA, and we discovered that that particular bird species doesn't exist in Australia. It actually exists in Denpasar, Indonesia. So we basically were able to discount that particular strike didn't occur here in Sydney. Also, just back on what Simon was saying, sometimes we get advised by pilots that the strike may have occurred off airport, say on short final approach to the runway. So the bird may obviously got struck then. There would be no carcass for us because if birds are coming in from the south or coming from over the actual fence, the carcass would either be in the water or on some land that we can't particularly access.
Thank you, Tony. Thank you, Simon, and also thank you, Brian, for your supplementary clarifications. I think that's bring the end of the question and answer sessions. I think we are ahead of time, so we managed to finish all the sessions and including the question and answers about 10 minutes before the plan or timing. I think our speaker has done the great job. So once again, I would like to thank AAWHG management and all the speakers who has put a lot of effort to make it happen, this webinar, as we have committed during last meeting. After this, as Ashley, who is the chair of AAWHG, also agreed and committed the two remaining topics will be delivered, one in mid-July and another one in mid-September. We have not put any poll questions, survey questionnaires, because two more webinar is yet to go, maybe, and then we will do again overall survey, or let's say poll, how all these three webinar been gone and whether that brought the satisfactions to the participants who requested this webinar for this year. So once again, thank you very much to speaker as well as the AAWHG management, and also many thanks to all the participants. Without your patience, without your presence, this cannot be happen. And also for the wonderful questions that you have posted in the pigeonhole. Actually, we have expected more than this. If you have any further questions, please send us by email. We can forward to the speaker and get back to you. So that's all from ICAO Secretariat point of view. As if you would like to add few words before we close the meetings, so I will hand over to you. As you would like to say few words before we close the session.
So sorry, Punya, your microphone clipped just as you were saying that. So only a couple of words, and it's simply, it's an absolute pleasure for the AAWHG to be involved in a webinar series with all of our friends from right across the region, and particularly our colleagues from the Asia Pacific office of ICAO. We look forward to the follow-on meetings both in July and again in September. And who knows, if we're very lucky, maybe there might be some borders open by September and some people might be able to even make it to Australia. But we won't plan on that, but we'll definitely have the webinar facility available. I thank everyone for the questions today. Thank you, Punya, for all of your hard work. Thank you to all the team from AAWHG and for all of those people that have hung in there listening and asking questions. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much. And so tomorrow we have a Wildlife Hazard Management Working Group, which is the third meeting, which will start 9:15 tomorrow. So we have, as usual, 9 to 9:15 for login. Those who are attending meetings from tomorrow, so we will see you tomorrow. Thank you once again and have a good day, good evening. Okay, bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Punya. See you tomorrow. Bye-bye.